Ja, schönen guten Abend, meine Damen und Herren. Mein Name ist Gregor Dotzauer, ich bin Literaturredakteur beim Tagesspiegel und habe das Vergnügen, hier schon eine ganze Reihe von Veranstaltungen moderiert zu haben. Heute ist der zweite Abend einer kleinen Reihe zu Fragen der automatischen Übersetzung, der maschinellen Übersetzungen. Am Anfang der Woche gab es schon etwas zu algorithmisch generierter Literatur, was das eine mit dem anderen zu tun hat, kriegen wir heute vielleicht auch noch raus. Ich habe 4 Leute dabei. Ganz außen sehen Sie Karin Tidbeck, eine junge Schwedin, die in Stockholm geboren ist, aber seit vielen Jahren in Malmö lebt und dort übersetzt, schreibt und Creative Writing unterrichtet. Und es gibt eine ganze Reihe von Büchern von ihr, die sie zum Teil auch selbst übersetzt hat. Das ist nämlich ihr Weg gewesen, um den internationalen Markt zu erreichen. Es gibt einen Band, der ist schon 2012 erschienen, der heißt Juggernaut und der wurde mit dem Crawford Fantasy Award für das beste Debüt 2013 ausgezeichnet und für den World Fantasy Award, den Tiptree Award nominiert. Und der Tiptree Award definiert sich dadurch, dass ein Award ist encouraging the exploration and expansion of gender. Also Sie merken schon, es geht hier auch um eine Art von feministischer Science Fiction und die werden Sie auch finden in ihrem neuesten Roman, den es auf Englisch gibt, den sie auch selbst übersetzt hat, Amatka, etwas natürlich dystopisches, etwas anderes gibt es in diesem Bereich kaum mehr. Und da gibt es mal eine junge Frau in einer fernen Galaxie, Vanya, vielleicht kommen wir auch noch dazu. Daneben sitzt Aljoscha Burchardt. Er ist derjenige, der von uns allen vielleicht am meisten von dem Thema, was wir besprechen, versteht. Er ist nämlich ein promovierter Computerlinguist, Spezialist für KI in all ihren Formen und arbeitet als Sprecher, als stellvertretender Sprecher am Forschungszentrum für künstliche Intelligenz hier in Berlin. Er hat sich in verschiedenste Dienste begeben, hat im letzten Jahr bei de Gruyter ein Buch mit veröffentlicht, herausgegeben, IT für soziale Inklusion, und kennt sich sozusagen mit allen Aspekten dieser Frage aus. Und weil Sie gestern schon da waren, kennen Sie Sylvain Neuvel hier, auch ein promovierter Linguist, kein Computerlinguist, aber vor allem, und deswegen haben wir ihn eingeladen, ein ganz großartiger Science-Fiction-Autor, von dem wir im Heine Verlag eine dreiteilige natürlich, Trilogien haben in der Regel 3 Teile, eine Trilogie haben, die unter dem Titel Giants bei uns erschienen ist, oder The Themis Papers. Aus dem, ich sage es auch nochmal, hat er mitgeschrieben an einem kleinen Buch, was demnächst erscheint, was der bekannten Serie Black Mirror ein literarisches Gesicht gibt. Das ist sozusagen ein literarisches Spin-off der ganzen Geschichte. Und er kommt aus Quebec und ist zweisprachig zwischen Französisch und Englisch. Er hat gestern gelesen eine Geschichte, die hieß Culture and Emotions, und darüber haben wir gestern geredet. Was heißt es, kulturelle Differenz zu übersetzen? Was heißt es, Emotionen in andere Kontexte zu tragen? Und heute wollen wir es doch ein bisschen mehr mit Texten halten, die sich innerhalb eines gemeinsamen kulturellen Horizonts bewegen und mal gucken, was für Unterschiede es gibt zwischen Gebrauchstexten und zwischen literarischen Texten. Und vor allem muss ich Sie noch warnen, wir wollen dieses Gespräch eigentlich auf Englisch führen und ich würde gerne darauf verzichten, es zusammenfassend oder konsekutiv zu übersetzen. Also wenn Sie einverstanden sind, probieren wir es mal, und wenn sich Unmut regt, bitte geben Sie ein Zeichen, dann schauen wir mal, was wir noch tun können für Sie. Und einzelne Sachen können wir vielleicht sowieso mal bei bestimmten Begriffen noch erläutern. So, let's start with Karin. You've been both nominated or awarded with fantasy or science fiction prizes. On another panel on the festival, Malka Alder described fantasy as a genre for women longing to escape their everyday lives, while science fiction would be read by men exploring new technological horizons. How would you define fantasy as opposed to science fiction?
That's an interesting question. Science fiction to me is a laboratory. It holds all the possibilities. You can do whatever you want with it. Basically, you can set up experiments, you can ask questions about pretty much anything. You can mold new societies and try them out and see what happens. You can ask questions that you might not be able to do in social realism, for example. Fantasy can do the same on a different level. When I write fantasy, I think about existential questions that I might not be able to ask in the science fiction or social realist setting, for example. So I think all of these, both science fiction and fantasy, don't have to be in opposition to each other. They're merely different tools that can work in concert or that can work separately, but there is no actually defined line between them. The edges are always fuzzy. I mean, the definitions are by nature very artificial, and what we write, most people I know don't really consider genre that much when writing the work itself. The definition sort of appears in contact with the reader or reviewer.
As I said, you translated both of your books on your own into English. So did you rely on machine translation, and if not, what did you learn about your own writing when doing the thing?
I did not rely on machine translation except for a translation program that I have. I learned that, and that's what I'm probably going to return to when it comes to machine translation. What I learned was that I have a different approach to the English language than native speakers do. And that means that I have perspectives on the English language that native speakers might not have. And I can do things with the English that native speakers might not be able to do. Very much like people who learn Swedish as a second language can come with very imaginative and interesting approaches that I would never have thought of.
Aljoscha, last year you published a paper on our digital future which was called Humanity Will Not So Swiftly Replace Itself. I tend to agree on most of the points you made, but are you really that sure when it comes to machine translation that humanity will not replace itself so swiftly?
So swiftly. Yeah, I mean, the working place of translators is already changing, has also been changing in the past and will dramatically change. I mean, this for sure, right? For many other workplaces that have been changed through digital transformation. For example, my wife, she's a graphics designer. I mean, she's not using pen and pencil or a photo studio when she wants to do an outline of something or a shadow or a 3D animation. I mean, she has it all in the computer at hand, so she's more like an artist director or something like this. And of course, I mean, working with language, I'm a computational linguist, is much, much harder than working with a graphics program. I mean, I know that, but the question is, where are the boundaries? What will be helpful for people? I mean, this is more the question, and what not. And I think we would probably also have like a split, that we have like the commodity translation. I mean, we just talked about it beforehand, that we said many things are just, I mean, translated for never to be read. I mean, just to obey some law that it has to be available in 25 different languages. But I mean, most probably, I mean, like some a repair manual will never be read in Maltese or so. For those kinds of things, you will use more and more machines, and then hopefully, if we do it right, then the humans, they can concentrate on what they are good at. I mean, doing the real interesting stuff. I mean, the literature, of course, the poetic stuff, but maybe also like the cultural transfer. I mean, the things, unfortunately I wasn't here yesterday, right? I mean, could concentrate better on these things and not so much on the routine stuff.
Sylvain, a fellow journalist of mine, Mark Simons at the Frankfurter Allgemeine, recently assumed that the fear of AI surpassing human intelligence might turn into the fear of not being able to compete with AI anymore. So is there reason to believe that AI might force us humans, our intelligence, to resemble digital intelligence in a way we never wanted it to be?
See, I never have a problem with technology. I don't think it's ever been a problem in the history of humanity. You know, what people do with whatever we come up with, and it doesn't have to be AI. I mean, I have AI in my pocket right now. There are many things that function intelligently. What I do with it is the question to be asked. But the technology itself is not. Yeah, I can't sort of think in sort of like doomsday terms or like what it would mean.
Right. The idea is that it rewires our system in another way.
Not particularly, no. Yeah, well, in little details, we become dependent on small things like a watch and now a phone or whatever. In terms of sort of changing the actual roots of our thinking system, I really don't see it happening.
Aljoscha,
Maybe we should disagree now. I mean, we know already today that, like, for example, that our Facebook timeline has an influence on our mood, right? I mean, the way whether positive or negative articles are flashed up, I mean, that makes a difference on your mood in a way. So you are, I mean, we are so in a way programmed by the machines to a certain extent, I mean, to stay on these platforms, and so we know. And of course, I mean, I think when we will use translation, that would be, I mean, like a secondary fear that our language might be, I mean, restricted to what the machines can do good, right? I mean, and it might become narrow in a way. And also the people editing text, when they learn that the translation result will be better when they use short sentences and so on and so forth. I mean, so that might also change the way people write, because they want to be good translated by the machines. I mean, there might be implications. I mean, not necessarily reprogramming on the web software, hardware thing up there, but in other ways, I would think yes.
I don't think we're really disagreeing yet. I understand we're influenced by things that have technology sort of implicated in it, but most of those things are still sort of humans behind. There are people writing those posts on that feed, and the way it's presented sort of will influence you. But I don't think we're thinking about sort of, it changes our perception of time and space. Someone in Spain and someone in South Africa are like just as close as your friend who lives 2 hours away. But again, I don't think it really digs deep into the sort of way the machine works. But
we'll make the disagreement still happen tonight. Just wait another minute. Okay. It's incredible what good machine translation can do these days, from a dialogue at the hotel reception to sophisticated literary text. But in terms of the theoretical challenge, is there a fundamental difference between text to text and speech to speech? What is the difference?
Speech to speech is, if you wish, I mean, either it is one step more, speech to text, text to text, text to speech. It depends on the way you engineer it. I mean, today you usually do this in a data-based way with these neural networks, machine learning, and so forth. I mean, when you have like text-to-text data, I mean, you can try to do speech-to-speech data recordings. You can try to train these systems directly, right? But otherwise, I mean, you have to take the detour via text, and then of course you have two more chances of making errors. In the speech-to-text and text-to-speech thing. And there is more to, I mean, we know, I mean, there is gesture and there is facial expressions and all these kinds of things that you want to treat at some point or other. And then it becomes interesting, because the neural networks today, they are not restricted to one modality. I mean, you can use both. You can use image and text, for example, also for disambiguation, right? If somebody says hello, and you want to translate to Italian, if there is a telephone in the image, then you say pronto, and if there is like somebody meeting on the street, then I would say ciao also, right? I mean, the image can then disambiguate the text, and these things are already working to some extent.
So let's start to talk about literature now, it's a literary festival, so why not talk a bit about literature? When I first came across the poetry of Arthur Rimbaud, I read it in a translation of German expressionist poet Paul Zech. In many ways, this adaptation gave me a strong but famously wrong idea of what Rimbaud was all about. But he, Paul Zech, claimed the following. I'll read it both in English and in German. So-called translations only reflect the skeleton of the original in the best case. What mattered to me, however, was the rendering of the poetic content, the musical, rhythmic, and onomatopoetic values, the dynamics of the human confession and its polarity. Of course, this realization requires all the tensions of a new creation. In Deutsch würde das heißen, hatte geschrieben, sogenannte Übersetzungen gehen im besten Fall nur das Gerippe der Vorlage wieder. Mir kam es aber auf die Wiedergabe des dichterischen Gehaltes an, der musikalischen, rhythmischen und lautmalerischen Werte, der Dynamik des menschlichen Bekenntnisses und seiner Polarität. Diese Umsetzung fordert natürlich alle Spannungen einer Neuschöpfung. So, in which sense could machine translation be inaccurate, literal, or unfaithful, Karin?
I think the first question you kind of want to ask is can an AI be an author? Because the translator is an author in their own right. When you translate a piece of work, you don't just translate line by line. You have to carry over the entire weight of the culture, the ideas, the style, everything into the other language. And in order to do that, you have to be able to grasp the original text, but also be fairly proficient at style. And you're never going to be able to reproduce the original in another language, because that's not how languages work. What you can do is try to make a faithful representation, but it's still going to be your own work. So I guess what that boils down to is how good a writer can we make an AI. Because if the AI can be made to be a proficient writer, who can make creative leaps, then maybe they could be a good translator as well.
I think accurate is sort of the operative word in what you say. I don't think there is such a thing when you come to literature. There are some works that are more, I guess, easily translatable in an accurate sort of way. If you have, say, a book that is some authors are mostly plot, so they do this, they do that, and if you sort of get the gist of that in another language, people will sort of get the same experience. Some of them have style on top of it, but there are a lot of books that are entertaining just for the actual sort of action parts of it.
People do stuff.
People do stuff, and then things happen. Woohoo! But beyond that, I don't think the word accurate means anything. It's like in some sense, it's like a movie adaptation. What's an accurate movie adaptation? Well, you don't change the story much, but other than that, the medium is different. We were talking about it yesterday. My books are dialogue. What's the French equivalent of a Brooklyn accent?
Are we agreeing or disagreeing? I'm not quite clear.
We're agreeing.
Oh, good.
We'll start disagreeing later. Okay. I don't know for what, though.
So when you, to give a little bit the technical perspective, when you want to make the machine smart, the machines are so we're not talking about this strong AI, the Frankenstein kind of AI that knows everything and can do everything and is smart like a human, right? We are talking about the weak AI. These are systems that are highly trained for one specific purpose, and we are talking, this purpose is translation here. And when you train them, you have in principle several different options, of training them. Either you can give them the correct expected signal. When I'm training, for example, image recognition, I show an image of pixels, right? An image of an apple, and I write the word apple, and banana, and write the word banana, and then hopefully the network will understand what kind of pixel situation goes with which letter situation, right? That's basically what they do, right? In a mathematical way. So then I give the right system, the right signal, and that's how also machine translation systems are trained. I give the German sense, I give the English sense, I give 100,000 German sense, 100,000 English senses, and the machine finds out which basically letters go into which letters that eventually form words, phrases, sentences, so on. So you give the right signal, and I think for poetry that wouldn't be possible. We wouldn't have enough training material because, of the variety that you would find. There is no consistent good signal, right? And the other possibility you have if you want to make machines smart is that you can give them like a reward function, that you can tell them when they do it good. Yeah, when a machine learns to play Go or to learn some computer game, then they can look at their score or whether they win, and then they know that they get a reward, and then they can improve themselves by playing as often as they wish to get the best reward, right? But for a good poem, giving a good reward, that would require a human, and then for training cycles, when you have like millions of humans that would have judged poems and put a number on it, school grade, for the machine to improve itself, that wouldn't work, right? We don't have a reward function, we don't have a good signal, so I would say then the chances to digitize it are low.
I have a question. How do you reward a machine for making the right choice?
It depends on the task. Right, when it plays a computer game like Pac-Man and it knows to steer the joystick, then you can read off the final score it has reached, and then this has been taken as reward to train again until it finds out what it has to do to get the best reward. For simple actions like these, it's simple to give a reward, but I mean for a poem, it's not that simple it's impossible, basically. Yeah? You know, that's my point, right? I mean, so the reward way doesn't work.
But of course, there's no semantic dimension to chess or Go, so poetry is completely different. Even if you could define some rules, how certain kinds of poems work.
And I mean, if I say the machines don't have access to any meaning, we don't know, right? But let me put it this way: the machines don't have any access to meaning, and the problem is they don't have empathy. They don't know what they are doing does to the consumer of what they are producing, right? I mean, often enough, when you produce a piece of art, you have an expectation what it makes with the consumer, right? You can imagine yourself in the situation when you hear something for the first time, whether it touches your emotions and not. I mean, and the machines simply don't have it, unless you can learn this in some way or other implicitly, right? But I wouldn't go that far to say, I mean, by reading some translations, the machine can implicitly figure out what kind of linguistic language tricks they work for doing a good transfer of the poet's meaning or intention.
Okay, I'm gonna be controversial here, and because when you talk about AI, emotions come up at some point, like it's a big, super thing that differentiates us from machines. But at some point, emotions are reflex conditioned, and it's it releases a chemical and whatever. So I think if you work hard enough, you could mimic that in a machine. It wouldn't be that hard. There's a great movie called Fast, Cheap and Out of Control. It's old, from I forget his name. Anyway, it's talking about if you build a more complex robot with just reflex functions, eventually you end up with something human-like. But when it comes to poetry, I think it's just a matter of the space that you would have to account for in your training data is just too vast and hasn't been explored well enough. Like, the language of news, for example, has been played with well enough that we've gone into just about every corner of what a news can look like-ish. In terms of poetry, for example, we have little spots of that space that have been illuminated where we can see what's there, but it's a dark ocean and we have no access to it, to all those possibilities.
Yes, to a certain extent. I mean, you have a given amount of vocabulary, you have, in many cases, you have rhyme and meter, and all of this kind of stuff can't be defined, which still doesn't make it meaningful, if I may use that word.
No, I mean, anyone can put together blank verse or hexameter or whatever, but translating... I just had a brain fart, I'm sorry, someone else go on.
I mean, you have rhyme and meter, we have rhyme and meter, but now I'm the machine. Do I have rhyme? Do I have access to it? Do I know how people would pronounce or spell or read out this poem? I mean, there is this old joke in Germany. How do you pronounce ananas, pineapple? How do you pronounce this in English? Is it ananas or ananas? I mean, this is a question how to trick German people. I mean, and how would the machine know whether it's ananas or ananas in this certain poem? I mean, to rhyme on something that maybe doesn't really rhyme. I mean, the machine in the first place doesn't have access to rhyme and meter unless we tell it.
Hey, but the machine could learn it, yes, in the proper sense. Not just the same like we do.
It's not a hard task.
Also, ananas doesn't really make sense, so that's...
I know. That's what the joke is about.
Okay, let's come back to what Karin said. She said that a translator is an author. So that's exactly why translators have copyright. Could we think of a machine having copyrights on a translation? Or is it just the company behind the translation system?
If I still get my fee, I don't really care.
No, I mean, is the machine a person or is the company the person in question?
And anyway, somebody has invested some money.
Oh yeah, someone probably gets money, probably the company, but I like the idea of having this specific program, having a title, and claiming rewards, it gets scores, and maybe we can build in an endocrine system so that it gets excited whenever its translations go well.
Because I know my translators don't get money for every book sold. They get an upfront fee, they translate it, and then whatever comes in is just the publishers. I'm assuming the AI translator would also be owned by the publisher, but it could be credited. Why not?
Yeah, absolutely, I think so. But it would need a name.
But something that strikes me often enough when you buy a book, then the name of the photographer who took the author's photograph is written in bold letters on the back page, and for the translator's name you have to browse through the first pages to eventually find it or not. This is like a little bit a misconception in the time that the photographer spent, like 20 minutes, and the weeks that the translator has spent on the book. But I think we should never let us force in the question whether we are in a man or machine kind of way. The machines are tools for humans to be used to do their job, to do the translation or whatever job, and the question is how far can the machines help? And I think we are not yet in discussing about fully autonomous machines. Because you read, of course, in the press near human X, near human Y, near human translation, near human Go playing, and so on and so forth. This is marketing, but it's not that we don't have to take this all serious. So I think we should really ask the question, where do the machines help? Right? Where can they support people? To take off repetitive tasks. Maybe also, like a very non-core task, like doing my calendar and doing my travels and doing my bookkeeping and so on, so that I have more creative time for writing, rather than writing bank account numbers by email and tracing payments and so on. I think but it's not our topic today, but I think this is my stake on digital transformation. That we really have to ask ourselves, where do I need support, and what is the thing that I'm good at, and how can the machine help me? Maybe also doing research, doing suggestions for translation. When you're not a native English speaker, the machine can suggest certain things, but you select what fits good, and then later on, of course, you have the credits for the piece of work.
Can I ask a question? You did some work on translation quality. How do you measure that in your work?
Let me first start with the bad news. Is that in the research area, they do a very simple trick. They use a human reference translation, right? And the machine translates the text. They call it human reference, right? It produces a human reference, and then they do a very superficial comparison, right?
Matches is good if it doesn't.
Yeah, how many words and how many longer phrases are the same as in the human reference? And of course, when you think about it, 2 seconds, you know that, of course, that this is a very bad way to judge the quality, whether it's close to that. Because in the worst scenario, the machine translation was already quite good, but it was only different than the human one. And then you force the machine to get closer to this human one, right? In the worst case, you make the machine worse than it could be, because you never found out how good it is already, right?
Or Larry, the human, could be a horrible translator.
Yeah, and we know, one thing can be translated in different ways, and different thing can mean the same. So language, is many to many in both directions. And so we devised, and then we looked at all the existing techniques that humans have used for measuring quality. I'm speaking more about technical translation here. Where a lot of money is earned, and the margins are getting less and less. And we found out that there was only one. They have aspects like from of course typography and so on, and then they have maybe also like the embedding of links and tags and everything that can happen in translation. But there was only one question that they all agreed upon that made quality was in this area was terminology, right? In technical translation, terminology is the thing that has to be right, and then, different people have different other things. And we found 130 different aspects of quality that we put in a hierarchy, and this thing is being standardized. I'm a little bit proud that therefore I'm talking that much. It's being standardized at this point for human translation quality, but when you have a real job, then you have to decide on certain aspects of quality. You cannot judge them all. There's accuracy, fluency, rendering of links, as I said, maybe also, but these are somewhat more technical aspects of quality than literary style or these kinds of things.
We're going to try to define some of the qualities of good translations in a minute. let me, before I come back to the thing you brought up between weak and strong AI, and I would like to do it by quoting the Bible. It's from the New Testament, from the Corinthians. You may know the quote, die Korintherbriefe, Apostel Paulus, and it's the following: He, the Lord, has made us competent as ministers of a new covenant, not of the letter, but of the Spirit. For the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. Der Buchstabe tötet, aber der Geist macht lebendig. Couldn't we think of a way to ignite this spark in AI? Because the letter is a letter, and the Spirit is just at the other end, but there are things in between. So where and when does weak AI turn into strong AI? That would be maybe the question.
I mean, at this point, we are more in the Chinese room scenario. You know, this Chinese room experiment, right? When somebody...
By the philosopher John Searle, yes.
Yeah, somebody sits in a box with, Chinese letters, and then somebody would say Apple, and they would just hold up the right Chinese letters, and from the outside, it would look as if the person in the box spoke or managed Chinese. And I think that's the situation we are in at this point. And to be honest, I don't think that when we have the same pace of development that we had so far and the same little knowledge about how consciousness and these things work here, I don't see how we would ever arrive there. So I would rather think that we won't have this spiritual awakening soon, but if so, it comes very fast. That's my but it's really, I mean, like reading the ball. That I would think that and at some point you switch on a supercomputer and it says "Daddy." Yeah, that's the point when you have it. But I don't see the steps in between. I'm sorry.
Yeah. See, I don't know. I'm going to have to disagree.
Yeah, do it.
Yes.
Stand up.
Yeah. I sort of disagree with the spark. And I'm going to go back to that movie, Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. Long story short, the guy builds a little car. It's a robot car. It has batteries. And he turns it on and it runs into a wall. And then he puts one sensor on it and gives it one simple reflex. If you're about to hit a wall, just stop and turn around. Suddenly he has a little car that just goes on forever. And if he puts like a bunch of sensors on it, that car can go around, avoid light, hide in the darkness, and it's a car with 4 sensors and like a dozen reflexes programmed in. Now, if you count the number of sort of signals that our brain / spine, everything receives every second, and the number of inputs it can come from, and you put that number of sensors and that number of reflexes on his little robot that can, not after too much effort, can go on Mars and collect rock samples and whatnot. But you end up with something that is going to be pretty darn close to like Earth. I don't know. I think what we associate with this like strong version of AI is not the spirit, it's the angst. And I don't know. I think we can get there, but I don't think it means anything.
I think we're I think that we're looking for something that, we're looking for what we have imagined as intelligence. Yeah. And I think if the spark ever happens, it's not going to be what we looked for, because we move within our sphere of imagination. So whenever that shows up, how do we know that we are sentient really? Was it Carl Sagan who called us molecular machines? Which we are. We just imagine ourselves to have, we have angst, yeah. Which is, I have angst, therefore I am.
Because at some point you can decompose it, and you have synapses that fire. You could, if you had a big enough apparatus, you could monitor every single one of them, reproduce the effects of the chemicals, whatever. The machine won't have the exact same thing because it's not a biological thing. But
it might have something else.
It's all quantifiable at some level. It's just hard.
I think maybe what we're waiting for is for it to do something spontaneous, then to produce something new.
Well, again, what is spontaneous?
What is that? What is spontaneous?
It's metaphors, we know that. But isn't this an anthropomorphic interpretation. I mean, take for example a dog steals a sausage from the table, and then like, oh, you say, oh, now it feels a shame or so, because I mean, like it, but maybe it's only waiting to be hit, and then therefore, I mean, it's waiting for the pain to come, and therefore, it knows how to react. I mean, to circumvent the maybe being hit or something like this, right? To just, I mean, put its tail between. So go like this. So I'm not sure if you could tell anything about what this dog now really feels, or whether it has consciousness, or whether it has some kind of knowledge about that. I'm not sure.
Difficult area. I doubt very much that dogs can be ashamed, but I think they can feel this and that.
Yeah, we interpret it.
No, it's not just interpretation. Okay, but that's another area. Let's move on a bit. Translators should always translate into their native tongue, never the other way around. So she does the wrong thing, the completely wrong thing. But doesn't machine translation also have something as a native tongue, as it is always programmed by native speakers? Or can we hope for a kind of universal machine one day where...
So, one thing is,
okay.
My colleagues, they were doing bad things. I mean, because when you have pre-translated text by humans that you would use to train these machines, I mean, they're not programmed, they are being trained by data, right? Then they would sometimes use the text, I mean, it was an original German, it was an English translation, but they would use it to train systems in both directions, right? So they would use a translation as source, and a source as a translation to train in the other direction, because they have the data once, and why should you pay for new data when you just can take it the other way around? So I mean, there are methodological issues, to put it mildly, in this respect. But interesting enough that when you train these systems and the neural networks in multiple languages at the same time, you see that they can do some kind of transfer, that they get better in those languages where they didn't have much training material by being trained in other languages. We don't know what I mean, learn is another metaphor, right? We don't know what they understand or what they do inside, but there seems to be something they can get out of the data, even if it's not in the target language, if it's in other languages. So they can do some things, but they don't tell us today what they're doing.
Well, in a lot of cases, their native language is not one of the ones you see, because, well, the typical way of training a neural net is to use a buttload of data, but so you do Chinese English, there's plenty of that, and then you do English Finnish, and there's plenty of that, but there's very little Chinese Finnish, so you end up you need a universal representation for everything, and these people are not going to come up with some weird way of representing concepts and knowledge. They're just going to use another language that's usually English, which is probably the worst language to try and represent a universal language, and that will be the intermediate between everything. And so, in most cases, the AI's native tongue is English, and everything else goes through it with whatever influence that has.
You can imagine when you do this proxying, right, through a different language, I mean, then you take, in a way, decisions, right? I mean, to have the sex of an animal. I mean, in German it's der or die Katze, and in English it's it, right? Then you lose information at some point, and then when you go to Chinese, you need it again, and then it's gone, right? And so, of course, then you have all kinds of errors through this proxying, right?
But what does it mean when you say we don't know what's going on inside the computer? I mean, that's a horror story.
We know what's going on inside the computer, but it doesn't mean anything to us. That's the point, right? I mean, when like the neural network, think of the neural network like there are artificial neurons. These are just, I mean, like mathematical buildings. They are connected with lots of connections. I mean, topologically, a little bit like the thing up here, but only topologically, right? I mean, not the same, but something. Neurons and connections between neurons that have weights and energy floats, and so they can do all kinds of statistical reasoning, if you want. So, take a metaphor. If you train your dog to bring a stick or something like that, and then you could take its brain and you could put it on an MRT scan or on an X-ray. You could open it, you could slice it, and all the kinds of things. But you could see what's happening. You could see the neurons firing in this head, but it doesn't tell you what it has learned. Yeah, right. I mean, so that's the situation we're at.
The same goes for humans.
The same goes for human. I mean, what do you feel when I say red? I mean, how can I tell, right? I mean, I can only judge from the outside that we have the different concept, the same concept, hopefully not the different. But that's the thing. I mean, these things are in this way, they are black boxes mathematically. I mean, it's clear what's happening inside, as with the brain of the dog, but it doesn't help. I mean, for deciding whether it learned to bring a stick.
We run out of labels. I mean, we don't understand because we're idiots mostly, but if you do Compling 101, you do your first little Markov model, and you know, you go on into little like slightly more complex things, but you have like, you know, four stages in it, and you can label these things, and they will sort of match linguistic rules that you sort of understand. But then if you add like 100 nodes, suddenly you don't know how to label what's happening at every step. And if you multiply that by 1 million, then it's over.
That's kind of a rule. I mean, either you have control or you have very good performance. Yeah, that's the problem. You don't have both.
Back to translation. Over and over again, we hear translators and authors complain that this or that novel is intranslatable. For instance, I remember just a Mexican author, Valeria Luiselli, saying that the most famous Mexican novel of the 20th century, Juan Rulfo's Pedro Páramo, is completely untranslatable because of the vernacular which is spoken there. And even in English, she's almost bilingual, but the English version doesn't serve at all. So could we think of a machine translation which finally does the trick for some other reason? Or can you think of Swedish books which are completely untranslatable into other languages?
Oh, absolutely. I know a few books, especially one which is written entirely phonetically in a northern accent with many, many local words, and is almost unreadable to someone who is not from that particular area. I have never heard of a translation, but I know of other translations that have used a similar dialect in the target language of like a similar sociolect, or with a similar sound, a similar socioeconomic makeup. So I think it's possible. But I can absolutely think of a few. I mean, I've had problems of my own when I had to translate myself, especially with my short stories, because I used a lot of cultural concepts, and there was one story I just could not translate into English because it's written in phonetic Stockholm dialect. And it would be interesting to see how an AI would tackle that problem. So I've saved it. I might try to run it through Google Translate or something at some point to see what happens.
Would it work if you found an English-speaking community that has more or less the same characteristics? Let's pick some random corner of Scotland or whatever, and you did it. Would it sort of work?
I was considering talking to someone who speaks Cockney. Mm-hmm. Because it's a similar sort of inner city working class dialect. Might work. So it could be an interesting collaboration, but it wouldn't be the same story.
There was an American show called King of the Hill. It's a cartoon, and it's American rednecks. That's sort of the idea, and they live in Texas somewhere, and they translated it in French in Quebec using Quebec slang, and somehow it just worked marvelously, and it was kind of scary and bad at the same time because it just made people realize a bunch of things that they didn't want to see. But for some reason, the sort of the transfer to Quebecois vernacular just worked perfectly for that show.
But I mean, translators have to solve the problem of dialect and neologisms all the time. And in one way or another, of course, you could also feed a computer with generating rules of replacing some dialect with another dialect.
Can I hang on with one thing before? Yeah. My question is, how would you measure the success? When would you say it has been successfully translated to?
Was it fun to read?
Was it fun? Exactly.
Yeah.
You were talking about the concept of quality, and I think the definition that I have of the concept of quality is whenever it meets the standards of the person who wanted it in the first place, which might not be quality to someone else, but if they got what they wanted and they were happy with it.
So Ulysses is fun to read, or?
Finnegan's Wake is.
I mean, it's just quality and what's good and what isn't good. It's just they're just nonsense words because they're completely subjective. Although I would be interested to see, I guess quality in an AI fiction translator would be, can it make me cry?
I mean, and it's actually a million times more important than whether it got the details right, whether the wall of the room was green or blue, or
right,
blue is green. Who cares? But
I want to cry.
Are you crying? And are you worried that something bad's going to happen to little Timmy?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So as long as you care about little Timmy, I don't really care if the wall's green or grey.
But what you just described by having this northern dialect, this northern Swedish dialect, is no problem which is reserved for literature. I mean, you have to deal with it even on the street. I mean, if you would have to translate an everyday conversation, you would have the same problem. So it's not either a dialect or a James Joyce, it's the two of them, which becomes very complicated, very soon becomes very complicated.
And you cannot learn this from data because you don't have training data of good examples of, Northern Swedish dialect being translated into Maltese or so, right? You just simply don't have data for this, right? I mean, and the decision, what would work, that's exactly what the machines are not good at. That's what I said in the, being emphatic, yeah? Knowing what will happen to the reader with something that hasn't been seen before, to say, this will make them cry or will make them laugh or will make them anything. The machine don't have a model of their reader or their recipient.
But without going that far, you could just add another mode and say, this sort of use of, I don't know what the written equivalent of a Brooklyn accent is, but it evokes certain things. And if you add that metadata and then you train it on other things that evoke the same thing, then it's going to try to give you some weird Maltese accent.
Please be more precise on certain things and then take 5 different people to annotate those certain things and then have a high level of agreement so that we could really generate lots of training data where these certain things are being annotated in a consistent way for the machine to make up, to find patterns.
They're called grad students.
Talking about Malta, you just mentioned the Maltese. It only takes one person, one good translator from Malta, to translate a text from whichever language he's proficient in. But it would take maybe 200 software programming people to develop a machine translation from English into Maltese. No?
You just need text, you just need data, you just need the pre-translated data, you run it through your machine, you can take any language pair you wish. You never know how good when you take Finnish to Hungarian, it will be worse than English to Catalan, that's for sure. But in principle, it's all just, data number crunching, if you wish. You don't need manpower in this respect. But maybe you need to produce the pre-translated text because they are not there. Usually, and the thing is, you need the text in the right domain. That's another question for literature. What is the right domain? When we do technical translation, you do it for EU policy, or you do it for legal text, or you do it for car repair manuals, and you train completely different machines because you feed car manuals or text from the EU Parliament or so on, and then you can translate car manuals and EU text, but not vice versa with a high quality. And I've just, checked the state of the art in literature translation, and then they say, oh, we just fed the machine with literature from 1920 to 2019. This is not one domain, as we call it, or genre, if you wish, right? There can be hundreds of genres in there, and I doubt that the machine being trained on fiction can write a good poem or so.
But it would be so interesting to see it try. And I so love when someone who comes from a completely different discipline comes into a new genre or a new discipline and just without any regards for the rules, just does their thing and plays around. And that's what I think AI translation could do really cool stuff with in literature. Because I come to English as a I learned English as a child, but it's still my second language. So, but I feel a kind of kinship with the AI because it's sort of pawing at language and pawing at English in the same way that I am, and coming up with some pretty interesting solutions.
I don't know. I think a lot of the questions we asked are, we live in an era of statistics. Like you win a Nobel Prize in economics for doing stats on people. And everything in computational linguistics and AI, pretty much everything, is stochastic in nature. And it's cool. That's the cool factor, because you end up with something complex enough that you don't really know what it's doing. So you have a black box and it comes up with something that's kind of like human-like, and you're like, ooh, that's impressive. But, I mean, when you start doing any statistics on language, you realize you can get 90% of stuff right very easily, and the other 10% is going to take you like forever. But it might actually not be attainable. And you might end up going back to a more traditional rule-based method of doing things. And in that particular case, your AI, you'll actually know what it's doing. And it will sound like, that's the thing though, and if you look, and there's a rule that says, well, if the person says fuck, then it should say this in this language or whatever. And you'll say, but that's cheating. That's not AI anymore. But it's totally AI. It's as artificial intelligence as neural nets, just doing statistics on swear words.
Yeah, we do that too in our brains.
Yeah.
We do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is the old dream of the Foucault triangle, that you would go, I mean, that you would understand the source text, I mean, would lift it on a semantic, language abstract semantic representation. I mean, people thought about logic or about what have you, I mean, some concept world, and then you would have a generative grammar in the target language that would take these concepts, these relations between concepts, and would generate them into a cohesive and so coherent and whatsoever text, right? But what is exactly the representation in between? What would you need there, right? I mean, we have it on the level of grammar. We have it like these rule-based systems that would know that red car goes to voiture rouge in French, that adjective and noun need to be swapped. These kinds of things that have been working, and then you need the 200 people for Maltese, and these things have been developed, and they are working in small niches, but they are very good, and you have full control. The thing is, with one switch, you can, for example, say the customer is addressed as in the formal or informal way, or are whatsoever, are headlines being like with a question mark, or are they in the neutral? You can, I mean, you can easily modify these systems. You have full control, but I mean, you do it. You are still on the level of I mean, transfer of words, if you wish, not on the concept, or like not on the pragmatic level of what kind of emotion is being evoked by this image here. I mean, I have a red apple in Germany, and this has to go into a yellow lemon in the US to work properly. I mean, it's a little bit hard to imagine.
You have this in proverbs a lot.
But what you have is just a representational problem. You just have too poor of a representational system and too few people to represent things in that system. We did work on weather reports, and we had this intermediate thing where we represented weather patterns. It was in this ridiculously ugly way, but it was a simple thing, and we could do it with few people. But
in a closed world, yeah.
In a closed world, but in a bigger world, it's still the same thing. You just need more complex representations and a boatload of graduate students.
I mean, Platon had this cave. We could maybe look at the concepts and bring them and implement them in the machine. Then we have them, right?
So would you say there's no disadvantage for small languages? We were talking about this for a moment yesterday. Or is there? Is there a tendency to focus on the big languages with machine translation?
Yeah, because of the lack of data, yes, there is the problem for the small language. I mean, so to speak, the digital distinction, I mean, is a problem, yeah.
And lack of data also means investing money, lack of money. Or not.
But there is an interesting, so to speak, observation, like in big language communities like Germany. Nobody cares for German. Nobody would invest into translation systems or so for German, because I mean 80 million plus Austria and Switzerland and so on. I mean, we are in the comfort zone, right? It's not even in our basic law that German is I mean, there has special protection status or so. But I mean, for Basque or Catalan or so, there is much easier to get money for building systems, because I mean, they are fighting for the language to survive. That's a little bit interesting observation in my area, that for the smaller endangered languages, I mean, the money is of course not that big, but it's much easier to convince people that something needs to be done. Whereas for German, I mean, nobody cares.
And what about not that familiar languages? Is it all just a question of the amount of data to get better in Mandarin and Chinese as opposed to French?
I mean, that's the question when you have also like languages like Finnish or Hungarian with lots of long endings on the words. I mean, the chance that you see two endings in a corpus a couple of times for the machine to find the patterns is low, right? Then sometimes people try to do some pre-processing, right? I mean, to cut off all these endings and say it's genitive, third person, plural, whatever. I mean, so that the machine gets some easier patterns to learn from, right? But as I said, we always have the trade-off between control and performance, right? And as soon as we start, we have a good idea what would the machine help, and often enough these good ideas don't work out. That's just an experience in language technology. Whenever you want to do it good, it doesn't work. When you take the brute force, the very simple methods, they work.
But I think some of our good ideas are just bad to begin with. We have linguistic theories that are sort of like biased based on weird historical things. I mean, our morphological analysis of everything is people were arguing against it 3,000 years ago. I mean, they knew it didn't work, but we're still like sticking to it as if it actually means anything, and it works. And you look at French and you analyze it with Latin grammatical categories that were actually copied from Greek, even though the words didn't really fit neatly in them, but whatever. So if we rethink our linguistic analysis, maybe we can actually have good ideas with a good way of doing it.
Actually, when I started studying computational linguistics, that was exactly my hope, that I would at some point learn what this grammar mess is all about. But unfortunately, I never did.
Karin, with machine translation getting better and better, do you think that people will become lazy in learning new languages?
I think people are already lazy in learning new languages. And I think it's with a language, you're only interested in learning a language if there are stakes in it. I mean, I studied 5 languages in school. I studied Swedish, English, French, German, and Latin. And I barely remember the last 3 ones. They've been of very good use, but I never had to use them because there weren't any stakes. So I think in general people will only learn stuff if there is no reward to it, if there is a reason to it. That's the only way to get people to learn something. So I think if you make it worthwhile, people will learn something. If you don't, or if it gets too easy, I mean, people are already lazy. That's just how it is.
You need love, some exchange student and someone who you can't communicate with and you fall madly in love with, and then you learn the language in 3 weeks so you can.
Want to tell us more?
I mean, we as Swedes are really, really good at English because we don't dub the movies. We have subtitles. So in order to be able to understand them, or in order to be able to take in all the Anglophone culture, we had to learn English.
But I think these are didactic or pedagogical ideas, right? I mean, whether you need to learn how to multiply when there is calculators all around, right? I mean, you can do one without leaving the other.
No, I don't agree, because it also has to do with culture and emotions. What he was talking about yesterday. I mean, unless you learn a language, you won't understand what the other culture is all about. So you need people to learn other languages. Maybe not Italian and French when we're living on the other side of the border, but.
So I was lucky to learn Dutch at some point, and it really taught me so much about my own language, German. That was really, really, I mean, insightful, and I would never miss it. That don't get me wrong, but I mean, it's not a question of good translation systems, whether we want to learn it, but as you said, of more cultural and educational. But I think poems would also be a thing. I mean, right? I mean, if we are now in the education business, I mean, that people would learn how to use their own language in a proper way, right? So spendet Segen noch immer die Hand ist von Ribbeck auf Ribbeck im Havelland. When you know how to use your language that way, right? I think then you can do much more with it than we're not.
So, jetzt haben wir 1 Stunde gesprochen und haben gerade mal ein paar erste Themen angerissen. Wenn Sie mögen, können Sie auch noch Fragen stellen in allen möglichen Sprachen, die wir auf dem Podium versammelt sind. Das ist eigentlich eine ganze Menge jetzt hier. 1, 2, 3, 4, ich weiß nicht, also fast 10 Sprachen kriegen wir zusammen. Wenn Sie was wissen wollen, bitte tun Sie das jetzt, sonst machen wir hier noch eine kleine Schlussrunde. Ja, es gibt, glaube ich, sogar ein Mikrofon. Wir fangen mal von da außen an und gehen dann da rein in die nächste Reihe.
Oh, thank you. That was interesting again. Thinking about translation and all the software we have, I was wondering whether there is a market to have an individual tool. So I could train my software to copy my style, and then it gets a certain sophisticated intellectual tool I can use as a translator. Because normally if I compare all the different kinds of translation I can find on the market, some of them I don't like. And I don't want my software to be trained on them because they have really stupid ways to translate stuff. So this is one question. Can we do it more individually and then have sophisticated translation software which is more helpful than the general one? And the second question is, do you think that translation software does help for people who have no idea about the other language? Because to be true, I only use translation software for languages I know, where I can check afterwards how I like the result. I would never translate something into Chinese because I would have no feeling what I'm sending off in the end.
Well, I guess I'll take the first part of it. You already do it for some things. If you buy a speech-to-text things like Dragon, whatever, it will be, you'll recite, you'll read a little bit of text at the beginning, so it trains on the way you pronounce things, so it gets them right. And if you produce a large enough body of work, you could easily train an AI to translate exactly the way you would, and it would sort of sound like you, but it would work towards your language, not, no, it wouldn't sound like you in Chinese, because I don't know what that would mean. So that's what I have. I don't have anything but the other half.
I mean, there are systems on the market, but they are usually for technical translation, right? But they would come with a basic language model because you often enough don't have enough training data in the domain that you want to go into, like repair manuals for cars, or like, I mean, selling microphones or whatever your domain is. And then you would usually add just, I mean, your domain bit to the general language part that is already there. If you have enough of your own data, your own pre-translations, if you have hundreds of thousands of sentences that you have translated, I mean, nothing speaks against, I mean, training the system on your own data. It's possible. It's only the question, I mean, how much data do you have, and how consistent it is. I mean, because this domain thing is, I mean, the more consistent your training data is with the task you're translating later, the better it is, right? In literature translation, it's a very good question, what does consistent mean, right? Overlap in terms of vocabulary, sentence length, and so on and so forth. And I don't know about much research in this area, what consistency means. I mean, for technical documentation, it's clear, right? Terminology is there, and so you're not talking about plot and rhythm and stylistic diversion and so on. And for the other part, I would say, I mean, I'm a record collector. When I buy from some Japanese stores, I use some translation tool just to help understand whether it's the right record. I'm looking for, so I mean, for information translation, for gisting. I mean, you're in this direction. I mean, it's very helpful for record collectors.
Dann bitte hier in der 4. Reihe. Wenn Sie es einfach mal weitergeben, dann.
Thank you. Well, I just want to 2 or 3 remarks. First, I'm very thankful to you because I think you know most about that matter, machine translation, and you're the most skeptical. And I'm really glad to hear that.
No, are you a translator?
Yes, I am. I am. No, but let me, and it does matter whether the room is blue or green, because it is blue or green for a reason. It is not a matter of interior decoration. It has a meaning in the universe of that fiction or novel. And this is just the kind of details that we human translators are aware of. And it is truly an emotional subject, because I'm testing DeepL. I've been testing DeepL for a year now. Yeah. And I tested DeepL with very, very simple texts, like, Samuel Beckett, great literature, but simple, short sentences, very small lexic. So, and it doesn't even work with Samuel Beckett. Or with Marc Lévy, who is a French author who I suspect strongly he probably uses software to write his novels. So, but even then, the problem with DeepL is, and this is why I really want us all to be very, very precise when we talk about artificial intelligence and literary translation. DeepL obviously doesn't know what it's doing. It doesn't know that the person who opened the door in sentence 1 is the one who is taking a nap in sentence 5. So, and this is why I wanted to ask you, dear Gregor, in your introduction you said, well, it's amazing what translation software can do at the hotel desk, and also, if I remember rightly, sophisticated literary sentences. Where did you get that from? Please, I want an answer for that.
I have to correct myself. I think there was sophisticated business writing or something like that.
Business writing. Okay, I'm sorry. I misheard.
I said literary. But I have to correct myself. You're right.
I run a translation agency, and we're in Canada, where language. We live in Quebec. So language is a sort of weird place in people's heart, and when they announced, for example, that the Canadian government had subscribed to some sort of Google Translate for the offices, people got super angry. But I think anyone ever pretended that these things do what we get angry at them for not doing right. They serve a purpose. It's designed. What's happening now anyway is designed so that you can read a newspaper article in Chinese and know where the accident was.
I'm totally aware of what it can do, but I don't think we should use the words artificial intelligence and literary translation in one sentence.
It's tricky, but there's a utopia behind it that I sometimes find interesting, like this. How we'll get access to all those cultures we could never even touch. And when you think about it, I'm not sure we'd be that interested, because what makes it interesting is all the culture that goes around it. I don't know how many...
Trust your human translators.
Yeah.
They're around. They've been collecting experience now for thousands and thousands of years. This is how literacy got started.
Yeah.
So I really trust the humans. And I like the way you were thinking of utopian. I had a Frankenstein feeling at a time, and I remember fondly also all the beautiful Dadaesque versions of Google Translate. But now we have a danger, I think, and you probably you can say that now some softwares are trained to make coherent texts. Without being doing an accurate translation. And this is a new danger. And there are some firms, and now I'm talking about technological translation, there are some firms who forbid their contractors to use translation software.
The big problem with automated translation when it comes to literature is not the actual automated translation. It's that because it serves so many purposes where you don't actually need a human, because it doesn't need to be good. You just need to know, there was an accident there at the street corner news. It lowers the price of translation. And that's the problem, because suddenly your literary translators have to work for half of what they were making 10 years ago. That's the problem for literary translation. That comes
No, not yet.
I mean,
back home, I can tell you the prices have gone down. We're slowly, Canada was kind of immune to all of it, but we're we're getting into this more European model where you have people who come in and translate in many directions for a fraction of what we would normally charge. Our rates have gone down in the last 10 years instead of going up.
For literature.
For everything.
But I mean, at the same time, also in terms of accessibility, there is a lot of literature that I would never get translated into my language because nobody pays for it. Some whatever Vietnamese author that is not being translated into German and will never be by a professional translator. And today, I mean, in preparation of this meeting, I talked to a friend of mine, a professor in literature studies. She knows a lot about also machine translation. And I said to her, yeah, what do you think? And then she said, yeah, well, the machines, they can produce some kind of, and then she was hesitating, artifact. It's not exactly a translation of this piece of art or literature, but it is something that gives you, whether it has any purpose or not, it gives you a rough idea of the plot, of what is being talked. That is what is being talked about. The question is it helpful? Does it? I mean, I was thinking the whole evening about the German translation of Monty Python. I mean, when we talked about the translatability from one language to another, and that obviously didn't work that well. But I don't understand the original, so my only chance to laugh at least a little is to watch the German translation. But it gives you something. But it's not. It's by no means a literal literature translation, right? But it's something, and it might be of use, but as you said, we have to play around with it. I mean, does it help for this Vietnamese author if I read this kind of plottish sentence by sentence, as you say it? It's not a cohesive or coherent text, but it's, I mean, yeah, you shift sentences from one language into the other and hope that what comes out is readable. But one can play around with it and see if it's of any value to people. I mean, and maybe later people or a publisher would decide to pay a human for a proper translation because they find out, I mean, it's such a nice plot in this, I would never have known before because I couldn't have checked all text of this world. I agree.
Gut, noch eine Frage hier. Ja.
Ich hätte noch eine Frage auch an den Techniker in der Runde. Sie sprachen viel, I should speak English perhaps. You were speaking a lot about generating data. I know just a bit about the story of machine translations, that you had this interlingua systems before, which were very funny, but not of much use. And now, so you're feeding another very anthropomorphic word, machines with data. So what does generating data mean for you?
Humans translating text in this.
Right.
Yeah.
It means you steal a lot of human translations.
It depends on the usage rights that are put on the translations, right? I mean, it really depends on that. I mean, that is another problem for us. Is like this data protection law and things these days also for crawling monolingual text, not only for translations, but we want to take people's websites to build language models, monolingual language models, and then there are legal problems to be solved. I mean, this is for sure. All right.
Oh, and even the old text. I mean, for the longest time, at least back home, we trained on Ansar, which is ridiculous. It's a parliamentary debates, and of all the ways of using language you could use to base sort of this universal translator on. It's a very weird choice, but that's what they had. Yeah.
I just have a problem with this vocabulary. I think data is something which doesn't really give an idea of what happened there before. What happened is that there was a sentence in one language and it has been translated by a human being into another language, and that's what you give to the computer, and that's what it gives to you back. But the name data doesn't represent at all this human this kind of translation that has been done before.
Oh, it doesn't represent the first guy who spoke either. It reduces, human activity to numbers, or because you could train it with math and it would do the same thing. But yeah,
Mahler's Eighth Symphony or a Picasso painting would, also be data, right? If you feed it to a system and do something with it, this way, this is not, not like devaluing the artistic creation that was put into it. It's only maybe it's a technical language, but it's not saying that Mahler didn't have a lot of work in composing this symphony.
Well, we didn't have the intention of degrading translators at all, but it would take a lot of time to discuss the field, and I have the feeling that it's sometimes much easier to feed, if I may say that again, Hemingway into machine translation than to have a highly idiomatic text from a news magazine which translates properly. So, because there's a kind of sound which doesn't really work, where Hemingway has this Latin clarity which can be modeled in just another way. But as you said, Beckett is completely different, though he writes so simple sentences. We would have to.
See, I think I'm also a translator, but I'll pretend I'm just the author for the moment. And I think before they can literally replace you, they'll need to replace me. It's what Karin was saying. You'll need the machine to be a good author before it could be a good translator. So I think we'll both be looking for jobs at some point if it ever works. But I think we're pretty safe for now. Yeah.
I'll be completely screwed. So those are my two jobs. I'll just be completely screwed since I'm an author and a translator. I can go back to customer service. Except that's going to be outsourced as well.
Learn Chinese because your boss will probably be.
Fair enough.
Ja, eine letzte Frage noch, dann müssen wir, glaube ich, schließen. Wir sind schon über 75 Minuten. Bitte. Mike, wo ist das Mikrofon?
Yeah, I think what's missing for me is anyone realistically trying to develop machine translation for literary translation, because what would be the motivation behind that? I think most of the research and the motivation is in investing in it for technical translation, for legal translation, and I think we can sort of agree there's a reason for that and there's a benefit to that, even if it is just monetary. But this whole discussion is super interesting, but it's very theoretical, because is that realistically the reason why people are developing machine translation or investing in it? I don't think, is anyone trying to develop machine translation for literary translation?
There's no money.
There's no money in literary translation as it is, so why would it be?
No, if it happened, it would be sort of an accident. But okay, so you have those super prolific authors who don't actually write their own books. They'll just come up with the general idea, and they send it out to other people, and then they correct what comes back, and then they send those little bits of text that were written by a bunch of people and sort of made a little more uniform by the guy putting his name on the book to like dozens of translators. I mean, I think if the technology was there, you might as well just create it from that general idea that the author sort of put up on paper and get it to generate it directly in whatever language you want. That's sort of the only scenario where I could think of literary content being produced by an AI. But otherwise, no, I don't see the interest, and I certainly don't see the money.
The only interest might be to make translations less expensive. I mean, the translation fee is in many cases much higher than to buy the book itself from small. Yeah. Okay, one last question over there.
Thanks. I just had a question. It's been interesting hearing about translation, but I just wanted to open as kind of like a general topic. I know this is such a terrible last question to ask, but you were talking about how we often anthropomorphize AI, especially, I mean, obviously robots and things as well, but this idea of a kind of human-like intelligence. I wanted to ask more about maybe two aspects. AI is built from language, I mean, I'm sure there's people who work with AI who are working very low level and looking at binary and shit. I mean, I don't really know exactly how it works, but a lot of it is written in like script, and that itself is a language. So how does that affect, I mean, we've talked about translation, but how is that going to affect literature and language? And I guess that's the second aspect, is it seems like literature maybe is already changing a little bit to keep up with the new ways that we think about language based on how computer scripts work and computer languages. And also, just as a comment on that, it sucks that we don't seem to learn. You know, there's so much at stake with learning computer languages nowadays, but it hasn't really been weaved into education systems like very well yet, which is a shame.
If I may give just one short example of how it translates into literature. A couple of days ago, we had here Hannes Bajor, and he was translating a spin-off on Beckett's novel, What? And this novel is called Mega What? And he translated it into German, but he didn't translate the text, the actual text, which a British guy called Nick Montfort wrote. No, he translated the source code of the whole thing. So this might be a case of how this translates into digital literature.
Yeah, thanks for this proxy. I would have done it at the beginning. I don't do it at length now. I mean, one could talk about the development of machine translation and the different approaches, but I mean, one approach that obviously didn't work that well was to do a real proper linguistic analysis of the source text, I mean nouns and verbs and adjectives, and then transfer them to a different language and do some rearrangements and then generate a new text on the other side that didn't work that well. In between, I mean, before the latest stage that I come to in a minute, you had these, the first sort of machine learning systems where you would have different modules that would do different kinds on the way to the translation. One would do the word ordering, the other one would do pre-translations of words and phrases, and the other one would smoothen it out and would do inflection and all these kinds of minor details, right? But these modules, you had a certain level of control. For example, you could look at the phrase tables, or you could check some inflectional things on their own, but these different modules, they would, I mean, now another anthropomorphic metaphor, they were taking decisions all the time, as I said, about sex and some things that need to be decided along the way, and so there would be so much friction between the modules that in the very end, I mean, you know, the systems pre-2016, Google Translate like Moses-based systems, I mean, they were horribly bad. The good thing for translators was that the errors, they were so brute force that they were kind of easy to post-edit. When you were in the technical domain, the verb prefix would be missing, a word would be untranslated, and so on and so forth. You could easily spot the wrong, if you had a half-good translation, you could make it a good translation with moderate effort, because, I mean, what was clear what was going on. And now you have the neural networks, they are end-to-end. You feed an English text and you show the German output, and you feed them like 3 letter bits, yeah, including interpunction, and spaces and all these kinds of things. Just 3 characters, 3 characters, 3 characters, and then on the other side you have 3 characters, and everything in between is learned by the system. You don't even know whether they have a kind of knowledge or representation of what a word is, or what a comma is, so whether they treat them, you don't know, right? They get these bits and pieces, and we checked them. For example, sometimes they were worse than the old systems because they didn't think in a phrasal way, like metaphors, yeah? Kick the bucket, ins Gras beißen, so they didn't see the whole but they translated word by word because they didn't find the relation. So that's what they are doing. So, I mean, they have no knowledge about language, or we don't know it about linguistics and so on and so forth, and you have no control about them, but they work well. That's the problem. Yeah, I mean, fairly well for what they are done, what they are good for, right? That's...
I tend to be skeptical of anything statistically based. I think down the road, if we had the right tools, mimicking human intelligence should be done with human intelligence. I think that would be sort of the best way to get there. Our problem with language, for example, is we have crappy linguistic theories. Just about everything was based on generative grammar, Chomskyan linguistics, where for the longest part you would produce, I mean, the grammar would produce sentences that don't exist, and they would just say, well, we'll fix it at LF, another module down the road. So you have a grammar that is of English, of all languages, that should, it's not the hardest. And you have a grammar that doesn't actually account for English at all. You have to have this weird thing at the end that will fix it down the road. If you're using that to model language for producing readable text at the other end, then you're in trouble. Yeah.
An dieser Stelle müssen wir, glaube ich, einfach einen Strich ziehen. Vielen Dank, Sylvain Neuvel, vielen Dank, Aljoscha Burchardt und Karin Tidbeck und Ihnen für die Fragen und das Interesse und die Aufmerksamkeit. Einen schönen Abend.